The jungle air hung heavy, thick with humidity, the kind that made every breath feel like inhaling water. The distant thrum of helicopter blades sounded like a low growl from a predator, but it was the crunch of boots on gravel that kept Sergeant Ellie West on edge. She hadn't seen a combat zone since the late 1960s, and she had never imagined she'd be back in one, especially at her age. At 65, Ellie was far from the youthful soldier she had once been. Back then, she'd been a swift-moving, sharp-eyed paratrooper in Vietnam, trained to jump from planes into enemy territory. Now, as a civilian contractor helping to coordinate supplies and logistics for a ragtag group of American soldiers in a fictional modern conflict, Ellie had become an afterthought. The others didn't mean to dismiss her, but they did. The young soldiers, fresh out of boot camp, passed her by without much more than a polite nod. To them, Ellie was just another part of the old guard, a relic of a past war that had no place in the new kind of warfare they fought. She was an expert in logistics, survival, and old-school tactics, skills that seemed outdated in an era of drones, satellite imagery, and night vision goggles. But what they didn't know was that Ellie had always been more than just a logistical coordinator. Her real strength lay in her experience. She'd been through it all, the jungles, the mountains, the desert storms, and she knew how to survive where others faltered. Now, that experience was all she had to rely on. The squad had been pinned down by enemy fire in a desolate patch of jungle for nearly 3 days. The enemy, a ruthless paramilitary group with local ties, was closing in, and Ellie's group had been caught without much in the way of defensive positions or air support. They had to find a place to hide. Quickly. Ellie's group consisted of just 4 people. Herself, 2 young soldiers, Private Jackson and Corporal Rivera, and a civilian Mara, who had been caught in the crossfire during a bombing raid. Mara had managed to find her way to Ellie's unit and was being carried on a stretcher by Jackson, her face pale and sweat-drenched, blood seeping through the bandages that barely held her wounds in place. The group had stumbled upon an old, abandoned vehicle, what looked like a relic of the past, a rusted, desert-worn military jeep half buried in the undergrowth. Ellie could barely make out its shape from the shadows, but the moment she saw it, something clicked in her mind. This would be their hiding place. It wasn't much, but it would do. The rain had begun falling in heavy, oppressive sheets, and Ellie had motioned for the group to move quickly. The wind howled through the jungle, the branches of the towering trees creaking and swaying like ancient sentinels. The leaves dripped with water, their colors muted under the blanket of clouds overhead. Once the group was inside the wreck, Ellie took charge. She motioned to Jackson to pull back the tarp covering the jeep's rear, revealing a small, makeshift shelter. It was cramped, too cramped for even 2 people to sit comfortably, let alone 4, but it was the best they had. Ellie quickly set to work securing the area, using what little she had at hand to camouflage the wreck further. She pulled vines, torn fabric, and debris over the top, making it look like just another abandoned piece of jungle litter. Mara groaned in the corner, her condition worsening by the minute. "Keep her still, Jackson," Ellie ordered, her voice low but firm. She wiped the rain from her face with the back of her hand and glanced over at Rivera, who was crouching by the jeep's engine block, looking uneasy. "Do you think we're safe here?" Rivera asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie didn't answer immediately. She could feel the weight of his doubt. She could hear the pounding of his heart in the quiet space between them. She wasn't about to give false assurances. None of them were safe. "We'll be as safe as we can be," she replied. "Now, quiet. We don't know how close they are." Jackson gave her a nod, though his face was pale. He crouched down next to Mara and continued applying pressure to her wound. Ellie's mind raced. The enemy was moving in fast, and if they didn't do something soon, they would be sitting ducks. She'd seen enough to know how this worked. If they couldn't fight, they'd have to outsmart their opponents. It was a game she'd played before. She'd done it in Vietnam. Hell, she'd done it her whole life. She pushed past the doubts that swirled around her own mind. Fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the bushes. Ellie stiffened, motioning for the group to hold their breath. Every muscle in her body tensed as the rustling grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on wet leaves. Ellie held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "Stay down," she whispered harshly, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The soldiers had learned to be quiet, but Ellie was different. She had learned long ago how to blend with her surroundings, how to become just another piece of the landscape. But this was different. This wasn't the jungle of Vietnam. This wasn't the world she knew. A figure appeared at the edge of the jungle, moving slowly, methodically. Ellie barely breathed, watching as the man passed within yards of their hiding spot. She could see his face, grimy and tired from days of fighting. He didn't stop, but Ellie could feel the tension in the air. They were dangerously close to being discovered. When the man was out of sight, Ellie allowed herself to exhale. "They're getting closer," Rivera muttered, his voice barely audible. Ellie nodded, her mind already working, assessing the next move. She wasn't ready to act yet. Not until they knew exactly where the enemy was. Not until she could use what she had, old tricks, the knowledge of terrain, and her sense of timing, to their advantage. For now, all they could do was wait. But Ellie knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stay hidden forever. Ellie sat in the wrecked jeep, listening to the soft patter of rain against the metal frame. The smell of wet earth and gasoline filled her senses as she watched the young soldiers, Jackson and Rivera, keep their heads down in the cramped space. Mara was unconscious now, her breathing shallow, but Ellie knew they couldn't afford to waste time on her condition alone. She had to think. They all had to think. The enemy was closing in. Their patrols were getting bolder. Ellie's heart had skipped when the enemy scout had passed so close to their hiding spot. A small, sharp voice inside her mind screamed for them to move, to fight, to do something, but she had learned long ago to push panic aside. It was about survival now, and survival was about using what you had, your head, your hands, and whatever the world had left behind. Her eyes flicked to Jackson, whose hands were still trembling as he applied pressure to Mara's wound. "We can't stay here," Ellie murmured, almost to herself, but the others heard her. Rivera, who had been pacing the small shelter nervously, stopped and turned to her. "Then what's the plan, Sergeant?" His words were sharp, but his voice held more curiosity than challenge. Ellie looked down at the wrecked jeep. She had seen this kind of thing before, a seemingly useless piece of equipment, left to rot in the middle of nowhere. But she knew better. The jeep might be useless for most things, but for what they needed right now, it was a gem. She nodded at the others. "We're going to turn this wreck into an advantage." Ellie's voice was calm, measured, and firm. "First, we need to create a diversion." "Diversion?" Jackson asked, his brow furrowing. He was young, his experience limited to basic combat and survival training, and he didn't understand yet what Ellie understood so well: how to turn the odds in your favor by thinking outside the box. Ellie stood, pulling her weathered pack off her shoulders and rummaging through it. Inside, she found an old, tattered map, one that had seen better days. The edges were worn, the ink smudged in places, but it was the only one they had of the area. She spread it out on the ground between them. "Look here," she said, tapping the map with a finger. "The enemy has set up patrol routes on both sides of this valley. But there's a gap right here," she traced a line through the thick jungle, "where they haven't posted anyone yet. It's narrow. They'll think we can't move through it. But we're going to." "But how do we get to that gap?" Rivera asked, his voice skeptical. "We can barely move without them hearing us." Ellie glanced at the map again, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "That's where the jeep comes in." She quickly outlined her plan. It would be risky, but it was their only chance. They couldn't outrun the enemy, and they couldn't fight them head-on. But they could deceive them. They could use the jeep as bait. "Here's what we do," Ellie said, her voice steady. "We're going to move the wreck closer to the gap. Once we're in position, Jackson and Rivera will set a false trail. You'll walk a few yards ahead, making noise as you go, so the enemy patrol thinks we're heading in that direction." "But what if they follow us?" Rivera interrupted. Ellie gave him a long, hard look. "That's the point. We want them to follow. We need them to think we're running. But we're not. We'll hide in the trees along the path. When they pass the wreck, we'll trigger the second part of the plan." Jackson blinked, confused. The wreck. Ellie's eyes gleamed with purpose. Yes. The Jeep might be a piece of junk, but it's still a vehicle. We're going to use it as a trap. She reached into her bag and pulled out a few old wires and makeshift explosives she'd scavenged from their limited supply of field kits. We'll rig the Jeep to explode. Not big, just enough to confuse them, throw them off course. The blast will be enough to cause panic. And when they scatter, we move fast. The others remained silent, processing what she had said. Ellie could feel the weight of their doubt, but she didn't let it affect her. She had been here before. She knew this was their only shot. We're not just hiding, Ellie continued. We're not running. We're making them think they have the upper hand, while we slip through the cracks. We're going to give them a reason to fear us, even if they don't know exactly who or what they're chasing. Jackson nodded, though his face was tight with uncertainty. Rivera looked hesitant but didn't voice his doubts. Ellie could see they were starting to believe her plan, even if they didn't fully understand it. That was fine. Ellie didn't need them to understand all of it. She needed them to trust her. All right then, Ellie said, gathering her things. Let's move. They worked quickly, pulling the Jeep into position under the thick canopy of trees. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, and the humidity was thick in the air. Every moment felt like an eternity as Ellie set the trap. Her hands were steady as she tied wires and checked connections, making sure the old vehicle would do exactly what it needed to when the time came. As she worked, Ellie's thoughts drifted back to the past, the jungles of Vietnam, the friends she had lost, the battles fought with everything on the line. She wasn't the same soldier she once was. She had aged, had slowed down, but she still carried the fire, the cunning, the wisdom that came from surviving too many close calls. She had learned that you didn't always have to fight to win. Sometimes you just had to outsmart your opponent. Ellie wiped the rain from her brow and took a deep breath. The next step would be the hardest part. It would all come down to timing. All right, we're ready, she said, her voice low and firm. Get into position. Don't move until I say so. The group spread out, hiding among the trees and underbrush, waiting. The minutes felt like hours as the tension built. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to remain still. She couldn't afford to let fear take over. Not now. The sounds of the jungle seemed to fade as her focus sharpened. The enemy was coming. The game was about to begin. And they had no idea who they were up against. The jungle was eerily quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving only the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Ellie's eyes darted from one corner of their hiding spot to the other, her muscles coiled tight, ready for the moment the trap would spring. She was waiting, her breath steady and measured, every sense heightened. There was no room for mistakes now. From her position in the underbrush, she could barely see Jackson and Rivera, crouched low in the dense foliage, their eyes scanning the path ahead. Mara's condition hadn't improved. She remained unconscious, her breathing shallow, but Ellie had no choice but to push that worry to the back of her mind. The plan was bigger than one person's survival now. In the silence of the jungle, Ellie's mind flashed back to Vietnam. To moments just like this one, where every breath, every heartbeat, every sound could be the difference between life and death. She had been younger then, faster, stronger, but the lessons had stayed with her. Think, adapt, outlast. She was still that soldier. She was still the one who could get them out of this. A low murmur came from Rivera. He was signaling to her, his hand barely visible through the foliage. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the familiar shape of a patrol. Two men, moving cautiously along the jungle path. They were on the hunt. Ellie's grip tightened around the trigger mechanism that was wired to the Jeep. Her heart was steady now, calm. They were right on schedule. The two enemy soldiers moved closer, their eyes scanning the trees, their feet shuffling through the wet earth. They had no idea they were about to walk into a trap. Hold, Ellie whispered under her breath. Hold. She waited until the two soldiers were right past the wreck, just beyond the narrow gap between the trees. Ellie's finger hovered over the trigger. Her mind clicked back to all the things she had learned over the years, everything from setting ambushes to crafting plans out of thin air. This was the moment. She couldn't hesitate. Ellie pressed the trigger. The jeep erupted into a deafening blast. The force of the explosion rattled the trees, sending a cloud of smoke and debris into the air. Ellie's ears rang with the force of it, and she felt the heat from the blast lick at her face, but she didn't flinch. Not now. Not ever. The two soldiers were thrown back by the shockwave. Ellie could see them through the thick smoke, disoriented, struggling to regain their footing. The chaos of the explosion was exactly what they needed: confusion, panic, and a chance to slip past unnoticed. As the smoke cleared, Ellie gave the signal to Jackson and Rivera. They sprang into action, running fast and low, darting through the trees like shadows. Ellie followed closely behind, keeping her head down, her body moving with practiced stealth. They had only a small window before the enemy realized what had happened and regrouped. The enemy soldiers, still reeling from the explosion, were shouting to each other. Their voices were panicked, jumbled, exactly as Ellie had hoped. In the confusion, the rest of the patrol would be too scattered to notice the group slipping away. Ellie kept moving, her heart pounding as she pushed forward. They were almost at the gap in the jungle, the narrow path that would lead them to safety. The sound of gunfire echoed in the distance, the enemy now trying to regain control of the situation, but it was too late. They were already past the danger zone. But just as they neared the gap, Ellie's foot caught on a tree root, sending her tumbling forward into the underbrush. She hit the ground hard, the impact jarring her ribs, and for a moment, she lost her breath. Her mind screamed at her to get up, to keep moving, but her body was slow to respond. "Sergeant!" Rivera called out from ahead, his voice tight with urgency. "Come on. We need to move." Ellie gritted her teeth and forced herself to her feet, ignoring the pain in her side. She didn't have time to waste. The others were already ahead, moving fast toward the narrow path. With a grunt, Ellie pushed herself up and sprinted after them, her old body protesting with every step. As they reached the gap in the jungle, Ellie spared one last look behind her. The enemy was still confused, still reeling from the blast. The plan had worked, but they weren't out of danger yet. Jackson and Rivera had already reached the other side of the gap and were looking back at her, urging her forward. Ellie took a deep breath, stepping into the narrow path. The jungle was dense here, but it was their route out of the enemy's reach, out of the chaos that had swallowed them whole. They weren't safe yet, but they had survived. "Come on," Ellie said, her voice hoarse but steady. "We've still got work to do." The group pushed forward, moving quickly through the thick underbrush, heading toward the only hope they had, a distant rendezvous point where they could link up with reinforcements. The sounds of the enemy faded behind them as they made their way deeper into the jungle, but Ellie knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Hours later, as they reached the rendezvous point, Ellie could hear the hum of helicopters in the distance. A search party had been dispatched, and they were finally close enough to signal for help. Jackson was the first to break the silence. "We made it," he said, his voice almost in disbelief. Ellie nodded, her heart still racing. She didn't allow herself to relax. Not yet. But she couldn't help but feel a quiet pride. They had done it. Against all odds, they had survived. Later, as they boarded the helicopter and the blades began to spin, Ellie leaned back in her seat, her eyes closing for the first time in days. The past week had aged her in ways she couldn't explain, but there was a deep satisfaction in her bones now. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked. But in the end, it was her experience, her calm under pressure, and her knowledge of old tactics that had saved them all. And as the helicopter rose into the sky, Ellie realized that no matter how old you were, there was always room to make a difference. There was always a chance to prove that wisdom, true wisdom, never lost its value. She had done it. They had done it. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself a small smile. The fight had been won, not just for survival, but for the dignity of every soldier who had ever been overlooked, every veteran who had been cast aside. This was their victory.